Welcome to Tabletop Aesthetics, where we do everything tabletop.
In this video, I'll be showcasing my second round of the Kaos Tournament. If you haven't already, check out Game 1 linked in the description. For this round, I'll be piloting my Adeline deck again, a Win-Conless Stacks deck. Omega Cloud is playing Kirik, son of Yawgmoth, Demon drinking tea on Niv-Mizzet Peru, and LJ Mesa on Edric, Spy Master of Trest. LJ goes first and plays a Prismatic Vista. He cracks it and fetches a forest and casts Finhorn Elves. He ends the turn. Demon plays Wooded Foothills and passes. Omega draws for turn and plays Urza Saga, getting a counter and casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks J-Lo and pays 6 life to cast Kirik. He then finishes with the Mana Crypt. I draw for turn, play a Snow-Covered Plains, and pass the turn. LJ draws for turn and plays Cephalid Coliseum. He then casts Night Veil Sprite and passes the turn. At end step, Demon cracks the Wooded Foothills to search for a Volatile Fjord, putting it into play tapped. Demon untaps, draws for turn, plays an island, and casts an Abrade, targeting and destroying Kirik. Demon passes the turn. Omega untaps and at upkeep loses his Crypt Trigger. He draws for turn. Urza Saga gains another counter and he plays an Urborg. He then follows it up with a Mox Diamond, discarding Homeward Path. He finishes his turn with the Scourge Familiar. I untap, draw, and play a Plains. I then cast Ground Abolisher and pass the turn. LJ untaps, draws for turn, and casts Edric, Spy Master of Trest. He moves to combat and attacks Demon with Sprite. On attack, Sprite triggers and he surveils 1, keeping it on top. Sprite deals 1 damage. Edric triggers and he draws a card. On second main phase, LJ plays Mystic Sanctuary tapped and ends the turn. Demon untaps, draws, and plays an island. He casts Ponder, looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws a card. He follows that up with a Dockside Extortionist. It enters and he creates 3 treasures. He ends the turn. Omega untaps and at upkeep he wins his Crypt Trigger. He draws for turn and his Urza Saga triggers at main phase. In response, he floats a colorless mana and searches for a Soul Ring, putting it into play. He follows that up by paying 4 life to recast Kirik and passes. I untap, draw, and move to combat. I attack Omega with Ground Abolisher dealing 2 damage. Edric triggers and I draw a card. I play a Plains and then cast Norod. Demon holds priority and casts Latnem's Legacy. He chooses a card and shuffles it into his library. We then all realize I have a Ground Abolisher, meaning he couldn't have responded. A judge is called over. Judge rules for him to put Latnem's Legacy back into his hand. He gets the treasures back he used to cast it, shuffles, and then draws a card to replace the card he shuffled away. Demon asks the judge if he could reveal the useless card he shuffled away so he doesn't get a potentially better card. He could not because there was no possible way to verify the card, regardless if he was telling the truth or not. The game then continues and I pass the turn. LJ untaps, draws, and moves to combat. He attacks me with Edric and Demon with Sprite. Sprite triggers on attack and surveils 1 to the top. I take 2 and Demon takes 1. Edric triggers and he draws 2 cards. He then plays Gaia's Cradle and casts Occam Adversary. He then remembers sequencing is a thing and casts Ledger Shredder. He ends the turn. Demon untaps, draws, and plays a Training Center. He casts Preordain. He scries 2, putting both on top and drawing a card. He moves to combat and attacks me for 1 with Dockside. Edric triggers and he draws a card. He then casts Pyroclasm. Ledger Shredder triggers and LJ connives 1 and discards a Scalding Tar. Pyroclasm resolves. Demon passes a turn. Omega untaps, wins his Crypt Trigger and draws for turn. Looks at his useless rocks and passes. I untap, draw, and play a Winding Canyon for turn. I then cast Drannith Magistrate and end the turn. LJ untaps, draws, and plays an island. He moves to combat and attacks me with Occam, dealing 2 damage. Occam triggers and he draws a card. Main phase 2, he casts a Looter Ilkor. He then casts a Personal Tutor. Ledger triggers, I respond with an Archivist of Ogma, which resolves. LJ connives for Ledger, discarding Collector Oof, putting a +1/+1 counter on Shredder. Personal Tutor resolves and he searches for a Green Sun Zenith, putting it on top of his library. I then draw a card and gain a life from Archivist. LJ passes. Demon untaps, draws, and plays a Crucible of the Spirit Dragon and ends the turn. Omega untaps and wins his Crypt Trigger on upkeep. He draws for turn, takes no actions, and passes. I untap, draw, and cast Adeline. I move to combat and attack Omega with Drannith and Demon with Ogma. Adeline triggers and I create a 1/1 white human creature token tapped and attacking each opponent. LJ blocks a token with Ledger. Demon takes 2 and Omega takes 3. I end the turn. LJ untaps, draws and plays a Yavimaya Coast, and casts Green Sun Zenith for 4. Demon responds and casts Swan Song. LJ responds and casts Delay. Ledger Shredder triggers and he connives, discarding an Elvish Mystic, putting a +1/+1 counter on Ledger. Delay resolves, putting 3 time counters on Swan Song. Green Sun resolves, and LJ surges forward and puts Toski onto the battlefield. I forget my Ogma trigger right away, because I forget Mono White can now sometimes draw cards. A wild new concept for me still. I draw my card later in the turn. LJ moves to combat and attacks me with the Ledger for 4, and Looter and Oakum at Demon for 3. Toski triggers and he draws 3 cards. Oakum triggers and he draws 1. Looter triggers and he loots a Jiraga Tree Speaker. He then moves to end step. Demon holds priority and casts Latinums, shuffling away a card. He still holds priority and adds a counter on his Crucible. Demon goes to his turn and untaps. At upkeep, he removes a time counter from Swan Song. Latinum triggers and he draws 2 cards, and then he draws a card for turn. At main phase, he plays Volcanic Island for turn and passes. Omega untaps, wins his Crypt Trigger and draws for turn, and sadly, passes a turn. At his end step, I hold priority and cast Path to Exile, exiling Toski. LJ searches for and puts an island onto the battlefield tab. Archivist triggers and I draw a card and gain a life. I take my turn untapping, drawing for turn and casting Sanctifier in Vec. Sanctifier enters and triggers, exiling all red and black cards from all graveyards. I move to combat and attack LJ with Ogma, Dranith, and 2 tokens. Adeline triggers. Demon takes 1 from a token. Omega takes 1 from a token, and LJ takes 6 damage. I move to second main and cast Aethersworn Canonist. LJ unfortunately forgets his Ledger Shredder trigger, and I end my turn. LJ untaps, draws, and goes straight to combat. He attacks me with Looter for 1 and Demon with Oakum for 2. Oakum triggers and he draws a card. Looter triggers and he loots, discarding a Jaspera Sentinel. He moves to second main phase and plays a Tropical Island. He follows that up with a Suspicious Stowaway. It enters and it becomes day. He ends the turn. At the end step, Demon holds priority and casts Chaos Port, polymorphing Dranith away into Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. Demon still holds priority and puts a counter on his Crucible. Demon takes his turn untapping. At upkeep, he removes a time counter from Swan and draws a card. He plays a Fledistrand and removes 2 counters from Crucible, adding 2 red to help cast Niv-Mizzet, Peru. He ends the turn. Omega untaps, wins his Crypt Trigger again, and plays a Reliquary Tower. He ends the turn. It becomes night, and Suspicious Stowaway transforms into Seafaring Werewolf. I untap, draw, and move to combat. I attack Omega with 5 1/1s, Ogma, Thalia, Aethersworn, and Sanctifier, helping to put him out of his misery. I attack Demon with Adeline. Adeline triggers. LJ doesn't block and takes 1. Demon blocks a token with Niv and takes 13 commander damage, and Omega takes 14 damage. I move to second main phase and cast Search for Tomorrow. Niv triggers. Demon draws and deals 1 damage to Thalia. Search for Glory resolves, and I search for Elish Norn, the Grand Cenobite, putting it into my hand. I end the turn. LJ shakes in his boots.
I'm not scared, you're scared.
Untaps, draws, and moves to combat. He attacks me with Oakum, Seafaring Werewolf, and Looter. I do not block and take 5 damage. Seafaring triggers and he draws a card. Oakum triggers, draws a card. Loot triggers and he loots, discarding Force of Vigor. He moves to second main phase. He adds 4 green mana with Gaia's Cradle and casts Endurance, choosing no targets. He follows that up with a Hope of Girapur. Ledger triggers and he connives, discarding Priest of Titania and puts a +1/+1 counter on Ledger. He plays Misty Rainforest for turn. He ends the turn. It becomes day. Demon untaps. Upkeep removes the last time counter from Swan Song, and it stays in a Blind Eternities since there's no target. Demon draws for turn and Niv triggers, dealing 1 damage to one of my tokens. He plays Fiery Islet for turn and sacrifices it to draw a card. Niv triggers and he deals 1 damage to another token. He then moves to end step. Omega holds priority and casts Songs of the Damned to help Demon clear my board. Niv triggers and Demon draws and targets another token. I hold priority and cast Enlightened Tutor. Niv triggers and Demon draws a card and destroys another token. Then, still holding priority, he casts Counterspell, targeting Tutor. Niv triggers and Demon draws a card and deals 1 damage to Hope of Girapur. Tutor gets countered. Niv trigger from the Song resolves and he deals a damage to the Stowaway, destroying it. Song resolves and adds 0 black mana. It then goes to Omega's turn. Omega untaps, draws, and plays City of Traders. He excitedly casts his top deck, Dark Ritual. We then remind him Aethersworn survived the Niv barrage and he puts Sadness onto the stack. It resolves. Dark Ritual resolves, and he ends the turn. I untap, draw for turn, and play a Plains. I move to combat. At the beginning of combat, Demon casts Submerge. Niv triggers and he draws a card and targets the looter. LJ holds priority and states he will counter Submerge if I attempt to take Demon out. I tell him I can't, but I'll try my best. LJ then hard casts Force of Will targeting Submerge. Niv triggers and Demon draws and deals damage to one of my tokens. Force resolves countering Submerge. Original Niv trigger resolves destroying looter, and I declare attacks, attacking Demon with Adeline and Omega with 2 1/1s, Ogma, and Canonist. Adeline triggers. Demon blocks Adeline with Niv and takes 1. LJ blocks a token with Endurance and Omega takes 7. I move to second main phase, recast Adeline. LJ holds priority and cracks his Misty, searching for Breeding Pool, putting it onto the play tapped. Ogma triggers and I gain a life and draw a card. I pass the turn. LJ untaps, draws, and moves to combat. He attacks me with Occam. I don't block and take 2. Occam triggers and he draws a card. Second main, he casts Solve the Equation. Demon holds priority and cracks Flooded Strand to search for an island. Ogma triggers and I gain a life and draw a card. With Solve the Equation still on the stack, Demon casts Cryptic Command, choosing to counter Solve and bounce Null Rod. LJ ends the turn. Demon untaps, draws for turn. He cracks 3 treasures to cast Niv. LJ holds priority and casts Mystical Tutor, searching for March of Swirling Mist and putting it on top of his library. Ogma triggers and I gain a life and draw a card. Niv resolves. Demon then cracks Cephalid Coliseum, drawing 3 cards and discarding Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, a Mountain, and Riverglide Pathway. 3 Niv triggers are put on the stack. Kozilek triggers and Demon shovels his grave into his library. With 2 Niv triggers, he destroys Canonist and 1 damage to Ogma's face, ending his misery.
Defeated!
Demon then casts Sensei's Divining Top, holds priority, and casts Pact of Negation, targeting his own top, triggering Niv. LJ forgets his Legend Shredder trigger. Demon draws a card, deals 1 damage to Adeline, Pact resolves countering top, and he runs out of resources to go for the win. He ends the turn. The game then ends in a draw again due to the short time limit. This game was all around unfortunate, with a short time limit once again making another game come to a draw, Omega being punished for keeping an insanely greedy hand, and myself being held at bay by another Ledger Shredder. Demon played well, taking it slow, and towards the end was so close to winning. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you can be updated when Game 3 gets uploaded, and we'll see you next time.